Great. And make sure it's recorded. All right. Let's see here. Okay, fantastic. Welcome everyone to our second webinar in the Viking Bespoke series. My name is Vikram Raya. I am the CEO and co-founder of Viking Capital. And as we're always an investment company, and we always help bring opportunities to our investors. But more than that, we also want to provide value to our investors as well. So, you know, as a physician for many years, I was providing value to my patients. And so as we've transitioned into the financial space, we've brought you education, opportunities to help grow your wealth. But I really believe there's more of a holistic form of wealth. And so that's why I'm searching the world for the top experts in so many different spaces. And I'm bringing them to you guys because I really would love to provide additional knowledge, additional strategies, additional thought processes as you guys ascend this ladder. And so if we can start sharing some of these slides, Ashley, that'd be great. I can show the audience what I'm talking about here. And then while we're doing that, let me just reach out to the audience here, guys. In the chat box, if you can, everyone please put maybe where you're from and you know, what's one thing about your health and wellness that you want to up level. And I'm going to ask my moderator Ashley to make sure that there people are able to respond in the chat. Let's see here. So Ashley, can you send a message into the chat box so everyone can see? Great. Awesome. We got Knoxville, Tennessee. We got Atlanta. We got Sacramento, Northern Virginia. People are talking about stress. Dr. Gabriel Lyons, that's exactly what you're here for.
So excited.
We got Northern Virginia. We got a lot of folks here. And again, as most people are entering the room, that's exciting. Honolulu. We got sleep quality, reduced body fat. We got Cancun, San Diego. We talked about Boise, Idaho. Great. Reduced drinking. This is a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about. We'll address a lot of these issues, guys. So can you advance the next slide? We got Philadelphia. Well, thank you guys again for joining us at this time. And I think you're going to really be pleased by what we're going to talk about. So why Bespoke, guys? I really wanted Viking to, again, address a more of a global sensation of wealth. And I really believe wealth is obviously beyond just the dollars and cents. I know you guys are building your portfolios, and I'm really thankful and grateful that you've decided to make Viking Capital as part of that portfolio creation. And so that's obviously financial, but I would love for your passions to be addressed, your whatever freedom you're trying to chase, the health and vitality you want, the clarity, your relationships, your time and location, right? On our last talk, we had one of the top world experts in travel, Black Tomato, and they talked about all these amazing vacations and experiences you can enjoy with your family. So by investing in things such as multifamily and investing in things that create passive income streams and increase your net worth, you can then put that money and time into things that matter, such as these 8 topics. So today we have a really special guest. Next slide, please. Dr. Gabriel Lyons, and she's going to really talk about the most successful people out there, the doctors, the investment bankers, the lawyers, the entrepreneurs, the people who start companies, you know, elite military folks, all the people here who are usually part of the Viking ecosystem. We're going to address some of that. But before I do that, why is this such an important topic personally for me? Guys, America is really not in a good place. 7 out of 10 Americans are overweight. 4 out of 10 Americans are obese. 5 out of 10 Americans have high blood pressure. 1 out of 3 are pre-diabetic, you know, depression, anxiety. And as you'll hear from Dr. Gabriel Lyons, there is a secret epidemic that you guys don't even know about, which is really sarcopenia and the lack of lean metabolic muscle on most people's frames, and that's essentially making people metabolically obese. So we'll talk about that in a second, but let's go to the next slide. So if we figure this out, if we figure out our health and we actually devote resources to our body and our mindset, you're going to feel better, you're going to look better, you're going to become more efficient, right? The most successful entrepreneurs right now that I know in the world, the most successful investors, they really master their mindset and their health and their vitality, and because of that they have energy, which I think is the highest form of currency of a sort of a high efficiency operator. And this also prevents you from spending money on things like, medication, surgeries, and other things down the road. And obviously, it just influences everything else in your life. And so, I've been investing in getting this for myself, not only as a cardiologist, but as a person who wants to figure out anti-aging, who wants to really have push the limits of what's possible. I'm running 3 separate companies. I'm busy family person. I enjoy elite sports. And how do I do this in your 40s and 50s and 60s? And so I've been studying some of this, and, some of it's cutting edge, some of it's already established, but we'll explore some of this as well as we talk to Dr. Gabrielle Lyons about, what are the foundational things we need to take care of, and what are the things that we can layer on top of that. Next slide, please. So let me share with you my good friend and mentor here, Dr. Gabrielle Lyons. She is a well-respected functional medicine physician, and she's founded something called muscle-centric medicine, which she'll speak about in a second. But she's a nationally recognized speaker, a media contributor to like things as Women's Health, Men's Journal. She's been on Muscle and Fitness. She's been on the Doctor Show. Her TED Talk last month was the most watched TED Talk in all of what was it, May, all over the world.
Yeah.
I mean, and she's trained at WashU, one of the either the number 1, 2, or 3 top institutions in medicine in the country. So a true expert in her field. And really what she's focused on is learning to talk about treating disease proactively, optimizing your health, and helping take care of sort of elite operators, whether that's, the best of the best speakers, entrepreneurs, multimillionaires, the top legal consultants, Navy SEALs. All of these people come to Dr. Gabrielle Lyons to take their health to that next level. And so I just am so grateful and honored for her to come and share some of her knowledge with our audience today.
Yes. So thank you so much for having me. Truly.
Yeah. Okay. Can you advance the next slide, Ashley? Okay, great.
So
I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Gabrielle Lyons.
I'm so excited to be here for, with you and for you. And I was thinking a lot about, what do you guys need to know? You're sitting there, you're thinking, I'm doing great. Where's the deal? What's the next deal? Why is Vic bringing on a physician? I don't care about any of this stuff. What I do care about is making money. And what I'm going to tell you is those at the top of their game, no matter what, are leveled by their health. Your success, your financial well-being, your everything is going to be limited by your capacity to get out there and perform. Before I tell you a story, I want to tell you who I take care of. I take care of individuals that want to move the needle, that want to change the world. They are the best of the best, whether it's an elite entrepreneur, whether it is an elite warfighter. I'm married to a Navy SEAL. He tells me he's a national hero every day. But these are the individuals that I have cared for over the years. And what's so shocking is that there's an archetype and that there's a way about them. And before, as Ashley is getting the slide deck up, which is coming, I want to tell you a story. So I used to have an office on Fifth Avenue. For those of you guys who are into investing and real estate, you don't even want to know what the real estate was. Fifth Avenue across from Central Park. I was in the office, and this guy, he was a Navy SEAL at the time. His name is Brian, and Brian was a breacher. For those of you who don't know what a breacher is, he's a 260-pound Texan. The guy was bigger than a tree trunk. And Brian was sitting in my office, flannel, hat backwards, like the normal team guy uniform. And Brian had been in the teams for 20 years. He'd been on multiple deployments to the most dangerous places in the world. And he'd never gotten injured. So Brian was home from one deployment. He was on his motorcycle. He was going 5 miles an hour. And he was hit by a 17-year-old girl texting and driving. Completely takes Brian out. And Brian lost his leg. And he's sitting in my office 6 months later, 6 to 8 months later. And I was like, Brian, how are you doing? And he looked at me, he's like, Doc, well, I'm having some phantom limb pain and I really feel crappy. I'm just so tired, and I'm a 5'1", 110-pound female. And I'm like, no, I'm going to get this guy. So I lean in and I'm like, Brian, how are you doing? And he looks at me completely bewildered. And he's like, come on, Doc, what do you mean? How am I doing? And I launch into this narrative, this story about how stressful this was for him, how he's totally lost his career, how, he's never going to be the same. And he looks at me and he was like, Doc, that was 6 months ago. And at that moment, I realized that most of us are still carrying stuff from 6 years ago. This is a prime example of an individual who's able to control top down. And by the end of this talk, you are going to take away 2 major things. Number 1, you're going to reinterpret stress. And number 2, you are going to be in the driver's seat of your own drives, your own dopamine ebbs and flows. So those are the 2 things that I hope that you are going to get from this. Okay. And then we're going to open it up to questions. Next slide. Now, here you go. You all could be any one of these extremophiles. Here's just a beautiful picture, whether you're a military operator, race car driver, or a family member. You operate at the extreme. Okay, next slide. So what is an extremophile? An extremophile is an individual who thrives under pressure, calm in chaos, masters of their fate, and driven by challenge. Likely, every one of you who is watching this has some component of these attributes. Next slide. Next slide. We'll skip that one. Okay. It's so fascinating. I was looking at the chat and people were talking about, okay, well, stress. Help me. What do I think about stress? So there's the obvious stressors, which is death, divorce, moving, jobs, kids. And then there are hidden stressors, which we all have encountered, whether we know it or not, whether it's mold in our house or Lyme, GI issues, absorption issues, all of it. But what's so fascinating is when we think about stress, we only have one word for it. I could say, oh my God, I'm so stressed. And it could be because I spilled my coffee or because I'm moving across country to Texas. Again, this is an example of why is it that we have minimal amount of words and understanding to be able to define an experience. Next slide. So again, bringing us back to what I promised you, I'm going to show you about stress and I'm going to show you about drive. And you are going to be masters of both by the time we are done. Next slide. Okay. Here's what I learned through practicing medicine. I've been in practice since 2006. I am curious. I wish that we were all in the same room together because I would ask you to please raise your hand. Who does this describe? Limited time. You push off any health-related tasks, frequent travel, multiple roles, late nights, early mornings. You push hard and you crash and burn, and you do this every single time. I guarantee it that this describes nearly everybody in this room. Next slide. Okay, So this is what I always see. So this is the day in the life of an entrepreneur. I'm so excited. Oh my gosh, I just totally screwed that up. This is going great. I'm going to go broke. It is this ebb and flow, the day in the life of the entrepreneur. There are so many different emotions all in one that it's exhausting. Similarly, the health of an entrepreneur is also very predictable if you fall into this CEO archetype. Your cortisol is high, you're exhausted, you go to the doctor. If you even show up for your appointments, you probably push them off because you have a board meeting or something else. Elevated inflammatory markers, increased vice use happens to nearly everybody. Weight gain and insomnia. Next slide. So we've been told about how bad stress is for us. We realize that there are two kinds of brains, and I'm making this, high level. We've got the unstressed brain, which is tight control. And then we have the stressed brain, which is kind of all over the place. But at the end of the day, we have one word to describe all of these things, and that is stress. Next slide. So I want you to ask yourself, where are you now? I guarantee you, this is the roadmap that you have been taught, that either there is death on one extreme, which is pretty extreme and final, and then there is enhanced performance. And there is a spectrum as to how that plays out, whether it is the absence of symptoms, you're kind of moving into this dysfunction, and then all of a sudden you're on a new wellness journey. There's a continuum. And this continuum, we're going to close the gap. So next slide. Now, this is a really important slide. And this is why it is so important, because right now, what you have been taught, what everybody has been taught, including physicians, as they treat patients, is that you have business as usual, and then there is an acute hazard. Acute trauma, you've lost a building, you've lost all this, company has gone under, somebody dies, something crazy happens, and there's a tipping point. You have an extreme stress response. And what we've been taught is that you don't totally recover. It takes a very long time. And then as you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, there's a permanent loss. And you know exactly who that is, right? So there's some people that, they've had a trauma, that they never recover. Oh, Bonnie was never the same, right? This is what we are told, and this is what we hear. And this is really a disservice to humanity. And this creates a fragile environment.
Dr. Gabriel Lyons,
if-
can
Yeah.
we just pause here on this slide? I mean, it is amazing. So many of you are wondering, hey, why is it so important to, be proactive with your health, also to build the resilience? Like, you've heard of the word fragile. Well, there's a word called anti-fragile, which is sort of resilient. But this green circle that Dr. Gabriel Lyons has on our slide, where it's investments to build resilience, I want her to sort of maybe add some texture to that comment, because this is really the difference between someone handling multiple stresses and being successful throughout their career and having sustained excellence versus the people who are good for a little while and then they crash and burn, and they're not consistently successful, and they're on a downward spiral.
And actually, most rookie entrepreneurs are on the fragile end. And that's, eventually, if they understand that they invest to build resilience, meaning they do hard things and they neutralize the experience of the difficult things. And that way they continue to build up this resiliency, whether it is taking on a new company, doing something different, understanding that it's all part of it. And they potentially build their resilience, and even doing that in the physical realm. So typically training for something, doing some kind of investment that is physically demanding, that allows them to prove to themselves that they are capable of more than they think. The other thing is they surround themselves with very resilient people. So one of the things that every single entrepreneur that I know that is at the top, they're not actually solo entrepreneurs. They do have, right now, Vic, you have a group of people in here. All the people that are at the top surround themselves with other people that have qualities that they aspire to be. which is pretty phenomenal. And so what happens is when there is an acute trauma or an acute hazard, the expectation is not that they go below baseline and have a permanent loss, but the expectation of building on this resiliency is they expect a full recovery and they actually come out better.
Yeah,
And
that's
this
amazing.
is
And
something that I have seen over and over again.
and guys, I just have to tell the business correlate here. Like during this time right now in 2023, that we're doing this presentation, there's a potential recession, there is volatility in the economy, people are overall stressed, and so we're seeing the rise of things such as Ponzi schemes and people losing their shirts on certain investments. But the companies that are smart, the entrepreneurs that are smart, the people who invest in their health, their mindset, their companies, and their way of thinking, they're building up a resilience. And so whenever there's an acute event, they can respond, recover, and be resilient, and perhaps even be better off than before the crisis. So this is absolutely amazing. Keep going. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks so much. So I'm not going to go into detail here, but this is a classic study. So this is a study out of Stanford, and it's out of Ali Crumb's lab. And basically, to make a long story short, is they took two groups of housekeepers that were doing exactly the same task. They told one group of housekeepers that, hey, what you're doing really matters. You're doing physical activity every day. You're getting a ton of exercise. This is really healthy for you. And they just told them that. And then they told the other group, they put kind of warnings up in the break area saying, what you're doing isn't very physically healthy. You have to be exercising. This job isn't good for your health. They were telling them all these things. And I imagine that's a lot of what you guys are hearing if you are on social media or you're listening. It's all of the things coming at you. But the fascinating thing that they found was those individuals that were told that what they were doing was healthy for them had lower blood pressure, had lower glucose levels, had lower insulin, and lost body weight. That is the first proof of concept that what we think actually influences our physiology above and beyond, stress hormones or anything, but actually influences our physiology. So, there was a couple people in the chat that wanted to learn how to navigate stress better. Well, my challenge to you is perhaps there is more than one stress response and that you've been sold kind of a false bill of goods. Next slide. So anyway, I'm going to skip this because I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A and time for Vic and I to discuss the physiology of stress. We already know there's a stimulus. There's a physiological experience that happens within the body, and then there's a response. But that physiology and that response is uniquely human, and the response is largely dependent on this. Next slide. So there was a lot of questions about sleep and fasting and body weight and sex hormones and all this stuff that we can talk about, but I'm not going to talk about it right now. So I'm going to skip over that because I want to give you something that's even more valuable that I don't think that you're going to hear elsewhere. So next slide. And then we can come back to the controllables. But next slide. Okay. So the new science of stress. We are taught that stress is harmful. It depletes, debilitates, inhibits, and should be avoided. Everyone is trying to do the warm bubble bath to avoid stress. Everyone is trying to, I just need to take this off my plate. It's too stressful. But what if stress was actually enhancing and improved performance? It was actually a biological response to take forward action. I'm here to tell you that this fight or flight response is only one form of stress. Next slide. And actually not the most common, and it doesn't have to be the most common. Fight or flight isn't just the most talked about. Women do something called tend and befriend, oftentimes, where if they are stressed, their immediate thing to do is to actually help another person rather than go into fight or flight. What can they do? How can they help? Next slide. So this is an interesting study. I'm not going to go into it, but basically what it showed was that this is an MRI machine. Vic, you're a doctor. I know that there's a handful of doctors on here. They put a live, huge snake on a conveyor belt, and they watched people's fear response. And what they found was that some people interpreted it as fearful and other people mounted a courage response, which is often what we see as the elite warfighter. And by the way, that courage response is totally trainable. Next. Okay, so narrative determines outcome. Again, so there's performance and a stress level. We think about disease, we think about being healthy, and then we think about disease. This is just what is laid out. I don't believe it has to be done this way. And when we think about how our narrative determines outcome, we always hear butterflies in our stomach. Well, what if the butterflies were actually leveraged to be put in attack formation, which is exactly what the best of the best do, is they cultivate courage through practice. And by the way, it takes a lot of practice because we're constantly told how bad stress is. Fight or flight is only one response. And typically, if you were to dig deeper, you will see that you will either mount an alternative response, which is the tend and befriend, or the courage response. Next slide. I'm not going to talk about this. I'm sure Vic has talked to you about this. I want to switch to the tactic 2, which is reinterpret the stimulus. And this is what I have seen work really, really well. So that's my husband. You know, again, he tells me he's a national treasure, so I put him on there. What we see a lot of the times is individuals that are getting ready to jump out of a plane, like a warfighter. They initially will mount some kind of like, holy shit, this is scary. And then they go right into courage. And this is practice. It's practiced by continuously exposing yourself to the stressor and within the moment using cognitive control, thinking yourself out of it. Like, I love this, you know, I don't know. It's like practice moving, right? Moving cross country, or, you know, like the worst thing that you can think about, which obviously is not moving, but you begin to practice courage. Let's say you are making a big deal and you're always like, oh, I don't want to be the one in the boardroom. I'm just going to send this person to do it because there is internal divisiveness. We'll practice it. So you practice it. One way to practice it is a 4-count box breathing method, which allows for a 4-count inhale, a 4-count hold, and a 4-count exhale. This allows you, and you do this, it's called box breathing or a tactical breath. So if you are going to go speak, or if you are going to engage in something that you know you are consciously putting yourself in a situation that is uncomfortable, then you can actually practice physiological control. That works very well, and it allows you space to reinterpret that stimulus. Next slide. So 3 actions. So the main actions, which we will talk about, control what you can. So you do have to regulate your blood sugar. We can talk about that after. Prioritizing protein will do it. Focusing on muscle-centric medicine. Someone said exercise is stress. Absolutely. And I've also included on the other side, what are supplements that you could take to actually help you leverage and kind of lower that feeling of that stress response, allowing yourself to be able to manage it better. We use oxytocin nasal spray in the practice, and then medication. And I'm not talking about, this is interesting, I'm not talking about medication like anti-anxiety medication. What I'm actually talking about here are nootropics. A lot of the time we use things like modafinil, things of that nature, which will allow you to perform despite fatigue. So those are a handful of tactics, which I'll answer questions afterwards. Next slide. So again, we're going to battle ready our environment. And we're going to move into dopamine. You guys understand that dopamine, I'm not going to go into detail here, but dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It actually is effective everywhere in the body. Dopamine is that drive. You make a big sale, you drive, you want more. Next slide. Dopamine, by the way, is produced in the body and it is depleted. And typically as high as you are going to go is as low as you are going to go. And there are things that release dopamine. That would be chocolate. So this is above baseline, the 5X, the 2X, nicotine. So basically if you're having sex while eating chocolate and chewing nicotine gum all at the same time, listen, my husband says that's probably the preferred way to have sex, but that releases a ton of dopamine. And when that happens, you will be driven to number one, replace it. So if any of you do any of these habits, please be aware that as you drive for these things, it will deplete your dopamine and you will secondarily feel depressed afterwards, or when you stack it, you get an abnormally robust release of it and you will predictably crash. Next slide. This is the most important slide in the entire discussion. This is the one thing that I want you to walk away understanding. Every single person here is driven, and every single person here has vulnerabilities. And you might think that your vulnerabilities are, I don't know, something internal or whatever it is, but where vulnerabilities show up, they are at the peak of your performance. Nobody expects that. So as you have a stimulus, you're getting pumped up for something, you're going to go talk, you're going to be on the cover of Forbes, you're going to go do this huge thing, your dopamine is going up. You reach that peak. Right at that peak is your moment of vulnerability. Every bad habit that you've ever had is going to come back, whether it's trying to buy another business, buy another car, have more sex, get another girlfriend, eat more food, spend more money. Because at that peak is that vulnerability, because as high as you are going to go is as low as you are going to drop. You do not go back down to baseline. Please understand this. For any of those of you, I was talking to one of my CEO patients, and he puts on these huge events. And every single time he gets pumped up, he's like, I got to bring the energy. I got to bring the heat. And every time after these massive events, he's depressed for 2 to 3 days. Completely predictable. So what we did was, instead of getting pumped up, it was like any other Tuesday. I'm going to go in there. I'm going to execute on the thing. Didn't get too pumped up. Didn't get too excited. He was even. He was neutral. He crushed it. Do you think he got depressed? Vic, you think he got depressed?
Not the way you're showing. It sounds like he figured out by not going too high, he was able to not go too low.
Exactly. You will still be able to perform, but what you will do is, you guys are in this for the long haul. This is about holistic health and holistic wealth. The way in which you really get that is by understanding the innate human responses to things. So understanding where you are at risk, as at the high and the low. So as high as you're going to go is as low as you're going to go.
So let's pause for a second on that. Let's give some examples. So,
yeah.
There's a lot of physicians on the call. If a physician is successful, perhaps in like a cutting edge surgery, or they do a amazing business deal, they're probably on a high. And then after, what do you mean by the vulnerability? What are they vulnerable to? Is it the bad habits? Is it to replace the dopamine high?
So it'll be the surgeon that never goes home because
Okay.
he's waiting for the next major surgery. It will be increased by going out to get more drinks after, feeling depressed. And the only way that he feels better is at work. Means they totally neglect their family or neglect any of the other habits. They're just sitting there waiting for their next case. So there's actually a whole host of things that an individual can do to mitigate that response. Other examples, risk-taking behaviors, gambling, extramarital affairs, any of those things, any of those habits come up. We see it all the time.
So, and you're going to teach us about the solution, the neutral.
Let's go to it. Let's go to the solution, because the solution is actually so helpful and easy to do. Next one. So a neutral mind, we already talked about, you get that, you don't get pumped. So for example, if someone is going in to do a major surgery, instead of being amped up about it, neutral. Instead of being so excited to do this next massive interview, neutral. Okay, next thing. Now I've beaten neutral to death. Let's go to now this is what is really, really helpful. Number one, become very strategic in the reward schedule. So many of the people on the call can afford to buy whatever they want. Well, you know what? Don't. You can afford that Starbucks. You can afford the Gucci, whatever you want to do. You don't get it. Purposefully restrict. Intermittent reward schedule, heads or tails, flip a coin. Heads, you get it, tails, you don't. It is not allowing yourself to constantly get whatever it is that you want. Limiting layering. If you love to work out with a lot of caffeine, a lot of nicotine, and a lot of loud music, you are going to get an exponential boost in dopamine and that is not recoverable, right? I mean, it is eventually, you spend time with family, you kind of chill out, but why not limit layering? Go train without music, no caffeine, no nicotine. Go through periods of limiting those things that allow for dopamine release.
So what you're saying is sort of like a dopamine holiday, if you will, right? You're just almost
It
taking.
is. It's very
You're
purposeful.
okay.
Yes, but a dopamine holiday would typically be like a 30-day thing. I
Okay.
don't necessarily recommend that because I do think being able to use intermittent, whether it's stimulants use or intermittent, any of these things intermittently, I think is much more valuable than a complete holiday unless you are a total wreck or you're totally out of control. Then potentially that works. But in clinical practice and taking care of physicians and taking care of the people that are really in the front line, it doesn't work nearly as well.
So,
But really
so
allowing,
cycling, would you say cycling things on and off, like whatever they're used to?
fast cycling though within a week.
Okay.
So fast cycling in a week. So lots of times what we do is we put together a schedule where, if there is a stimulant use, it's going to be Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The intermittent reward schedule, again, typically we might go a week without any kind of reward. And then limiting layering, which is done very purposefully. And that could be typically every Sunday, every Saturday and Sunday. So really being very strategic at how individuals are using the things that they are leveraging and being very aware of it. So those are the thing. And then also, again, controlled intensity. Intensity is very compelling, right? It's so fun to get amped up and be intense, but actually turning it on and practicing turning it on. And I know that this sounds kind of silly because you're consciously turning this innate hunter on for 5 minutes, and then you're practicing turning it off. It's like the ultimate in task switching, which we're not really talking about task switching because we're talking about it here, but controlling the intensity, focusing on the discomfort, really leaning into it, and then turning it off. For example, if you have to write a book, that's not fun. Really going in and say, okay, for 10 minutes, I'm just going to completely suffer. And then you're going to turn it off. You're going to totally suffer. You're going to have to do a talk. Maybe you put together a talk that you really have to think about and suffer through and pick something that you don't want to do and then turn it off. So those are some of the things. All right, next slide. So I just want to point out the obvious. So we are in an environment that is very different than the environment that I think the humans are accustomed to. So we've all heard of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And originally it was like, the human survival, which was food, water, clothes, and then safety and security, love and belonging, esteem, and then self-actualization. Well, now it's like, does my Wi-Fi work? Do I have Google password on? And the connection is through Instagram or any of these other means. And I think that if we don't manage how that creates challenges within our own life, then it does leave us even more vulnerable to distraction. And ultimately, those who really, really, really succeed are able to control the distraction. And just understanding, I just wanted to mention it. It's not the whole purpose of really anything, but to just bring awareness of where our actual needs are now. Next slide. And so to sum this up, the health of the mind entrepreneur is deeply embedded in the mind. And really the ultimate mind frame of the entrepreneur is to prioritize health, to not have a narrative. Like Brian had no narrative. It was the most odd thing. And then, by the way, when I tell that story, the other SEALs are like, yeah, dude, why were you asking him? That had happened months ago. So there is this way of creating a neutral narrative that allows for execution without all the clutter, and then adaptability to an environment, execution, and then, I think really being aware of weaknesses. So.
Awesome. That was amazing. We're going to get to some Q&A in a second, but overall, guys, by focusing on your health, by your vitality, and just sort of your mindset, healthcare costs improve, your lifestyle cost improve, you become much more efficient, you create a legacy, you create momentum, you prevent disease, and you go after your passion. So that's why we should take action on all this. So next slide. And Dr. Gabrielle Lyons, you have a new book coming out.
Oh my gosh, yes. So I have a book coming out, Simon & Schuster, called Forever Strong, and it really talks about the concept that we don't actually have this obesity epidemic, but what we really have is a midlife muscle crisis. It's cool. If you guys want to, it's available for pre-order. There's all kinds of things that we are doing. We're doing Q&As like this, all kinds of things that are happening. So if you guys are interested, feel free to connect with me. There's a QR code. Love
That's
to
awesome.
chat.
Yeah, and it's, as you can see, it's really talking about burning fat, fighting heart disease, reversing diabetes, staying sharp, building muscle, boosting energy. So these are all the things I think that the folks who are proactive are really focusing on. And so, if any of these are issues for you, this is the time. We have a good Q&A. We have a good, I think, 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A. So guys, put in the chat box any questions you have about high performance, stress, any things that you're dealing with medically, or things you want to optimize. And Dr. Gabrielle Lyons, and then I can take a few as well. I can answer these. So let's see here. We got something in the Q&A here. Let me just take a look. Let's see here. Can you tell us more about muscle-centric medicine? Great.
Yeah. Okay. So you guys are going to have your mind blown, right? So everybody talks about obesity and that obesity is at the root cause. But I don't actually believe that we have an obesity epidemic. Years before we start to see issues with body composition, we have dysfunctional skeletal muscle. And so the idea of muscle-centric medicine is doing everything to optimize skeletal muscle as the pinnacle rather than the periphery. The diseases that we're seeing now, obesity, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, these are diseases of skeletal muscle first. And so at its core, it's doing everything to optimize that.
And why do you think there's so, like, in the medical term for not having skeletal muscle is called sarcopenia? Why do you think there's so much of this lack of muscle development in people the second half of their life?
I think that it begins really early on. We're largely physically inactive. And then what happens is we create a nutritional strategy that doesn't support our skeletal muscle. And then the other thing is we live in an environment that it's shocking, right? So I was looking at some of the literature. There's things that actually affect our ability to build lean muscle. And I'm not talking about the obvious like sleep and hormones, but there are environmental issues, arsenic. There's all kinds of things that we don't recognize. So skeletal muscle, which is so interesting, is actually an endocrine organ. It is the largest endocrine organ system in the body. When you contract skeletal muscle, it secretes myokines. Myokines are peptides, which for those people who don't know, peptides, they're a handful of amino acids strung together, and they go throughout the body and they act in a hormone-like fashion. So contracting skeletal muscle decreases inflammation, impacts brain function. It helps partition our nutrients. So the foods that we eat, above and beyond just exercise, it really is this organ system, which is so fascinating.
So people are asking about things such as peak performance, like around, I guess, maybe around after age 50. What do you recommend as strategies for people who are 50 and above who want to really improve their peak performance in many aspects of their life?
Yeah, so I think really defining what peak performance is it, so there has to be a component of physical, mental, I think really having something well-rounded. Number one, exercise has the biggest impact, talking about doing resistance training 3 to 4 days a week, right? We probably all know that 24% of adults are meeting those physical exercise requirements. 24% are meeting physical activity, moderate to vigorous activity, plus 2 days of resistance training. So exercise is first. Nobody is meeting that. So I recommend 3 to 4 days a week of resistance training, some kind of something like a high intensity interval or sprint interval training that is really going to challenge you. Depending on the intensity of that, that could be 3 days a week or one just barf out session that's 4 minutes at 100% your max. The other part that people have to get right is 100% of people eat. So you have to nail that part. 24% of people exercise, 100% of people eat. So you have to really prioritize dietary protein and feed for muscle health over the long term.
So you're like, let's say, as you said, you were 110, 115 pounds, like a typical woman, let's say between 100 to like 125 pounds. How much protein should they eat?
So if it depends on her, her body composition, but I would recommend 120 grams of protein.
And
And that first and that last meal are the most important. And there's a lot of conversation and confusion around protein. Actually, my book does a good job at clearing all that up. It talks all about the history of how we got to where we are. But that first meal should be robust, 40 to 50 grams of protein in that last meal. And you've really covered it from a muscle protection standpoint.
I have a question here in the chat. So talking about what are the benefits for fasting? Do you believe in fasting? Is it good for muscle growth? Is it not good for muscle growth? What do you think?
Fasting, great question, Vic. So fasting is not good for muscle growth. The reason an individual would fast would be twofold. Number one, when you are talking about fasting for longevity, the question becomes how long does one need to do it? And does one need to fast at all versus periods of caloric restriction, significant caloric restriction? Could you do calorie restriction plus exercise? There's all different ways to get to the underlying end result, which I think for people is autophagy. And autophagy is a very broad term of kind of cleaning out these old cells. So the question becomes, why fasting? And what potentially could be the benefits? And if fasting is the only avenue forward. Fasting is one tool and one modality. It is very good for people who have GI issues. It is very good for people that struggle with being able to control their food intake. It is not good for skeletal muscle, and it is not good for performance.
And tell me about, we have someone who's planning to scale Mount Rainier. What would be a good sort of a strategy for that person in terms of preparation?
That's a great question. And typically the answer would be training like you would be climbing. So you kind of train like you play. And of course, getting into someone who has done it before, I'm sure they have programs, whether it's weighted rocks, all that stuff. But
so I
training.
climbed Kilimanjaro, was it last year? Yeah, last year. And so I think like a ton of leg workouts, high intensity interval training. If you can train at altitude, that'd be very helpful because altitude is really what's going to hold you back. There are medications that you can take while you're on the mountain, Diamox, dexamethasone as well. So things to consider. The next question, Dr. Gabriel, is someone's asking about drinking less alcohol. I think I saw that a couple of times. So people want to curtail that habit, but whether it's a mindset or is it a strategic way to do it, or is it just some kind of habit hacking or layering strategy? What do you think?
Yeah, you're never going to be ready. So if you're someone who enjoys drinking, you're not going to be ready. But then you have to remember times that you were strong in the past, that you were never ready to do the thing that you weren't wanting to do, and you just do it. You just do it. You commit. You don't think I'm going to do it tomorrow. You have to know yourself. You have to ask yourself, if you keep doing this habit, what is that outcome? I think drinking is terrible for you. I don't drink. Number one, it tastes like rubbing alcohol, but number two, it's like a poison. It affects sleep. It affects all of these things. It's totally not worth it. I mean, that's just my opinion.
And is there like a strategy for caffeine as well? Do you recommend restriction of caffeine or using it intermittently?
I don't. So you can do intermittent restriction of caffeine. Yes, it is brutal. You will feel miserable. Yes. So I do intermittent reward schedules with caffeine, typically every week.
And let's see here.
And there's no right or wrong way to do it. You can do it, once a week. You can do it once every 2 weeks. But again, you do have to do it.
Okay. So I got a bunch of questions here on, okay. So, a lot of people get lab work done, Dr. Gabriel Lyons, and, from what I know, most lab work is pretty skimpy at the traditional doctor's office. So is there certain lab parameters that you absolutely must add on, even if it's your traditional doctor can probably add it on? What would be some of those specific lab markers that would help unveil what's going on in a person's body?
Yeah, I think that that's a really broad question. So I'm going to start with some of the biggest ones. I think everyone should know their hormones, a full hormone panel, a free and total testosterone, your estrogens, your sex hormone binding globulin. You should know prolactin. You should just know your hormonal status, right? I think everybody, and it shouldn't just be a total testosterone. It should be everything. So I think that that's really important. And what you could just ask for is you could ask for a comprehensive hormone panel. The other thing that I think is really important to know is your ApoB status. I'm sorry, yes, your ApoB status. I think that that is really important. And so that will address cardiovascular risk, as you know. The other thing that I think is really important to look at is iron. People don't really talk about that iron and full iron studies, iron, ferritin. It'll give you a sense of what your absorption is like. And I think that that's really important. I also think a full thyroid panel, especially for women, is really important. So that's free T3, free T4, TSH, and full antibodies. Thyroid antibodies are important. I do think it's important to look at both HSCRP, which is C-reactive protein produced in the liver, as well as a SED rate. So I do think that it's really important to look at a SED rate, which is an ESR, vitamin D, obviously an omega-3 index. Vic, I always get at least a baseline, at least an LPA on all patients, which I know is not really tradition, but LP(a), just to get a sense of where their genetics are. We take so many blood markers, but that's a good start.
Yeah, I love that. There's so many questions. Your talk is sparking so much interest. So thank you again, Dr. Gabriel. What are your views on a whole plant-based diet? And if so, how do you optimize the quality of proteins in that diet?
So my views of a plant-based diet are if you consume enough protein, if you consume enough calories, you can compensate for the lack of protein quality. Meaning, so the RDA, which is the minimum amount of protein required, is 0.8 grams per kg. That doesn't take into account a plant-based diet. A plant-based diet would need roughly double that amount of protein to cover the basis of the amino acids necessary. Meaning that the more plant-based you are, the more total protein that you need to compensate for the lower quality of protein. And protein it's not an emotional thing. High quality protein is considered animal-based proteins because of the amino acid profile, which is what makes up the protein. Low quality proteins are plant-based proteins. I will tell you this, there is data that has been coming out that if an individual that typically it's not just protein as the macronutrient, but there are other bioactive compounds and micronutrients like iron and zinc, selenium. So the recommendation that is at least 50% of your protein should be coming from animal-based sources, because again, we're not just talking about protein, but the food as a matrix. So I think eating plants is great. And I definitely think a balanced diet of animal-based products and plants is the way to go.
I have another question. Morning cortisol levels tend to increase as we age. What are the techniques we can be used to lower cortisol in addition to such as meditation and exercise in the morning?
Yeah, so I like cortisol levels high in the morning. They should be high. They're your get up and go. I don't like cortisol levels that remain high over the day, but cortisol in the morning, I think is a good thing. And I think making sure you don't have sleep apnea, that's really overlooked for people.
And there's a lot of questions. I'm going to sort of lump a couple of questions together. Sounds like there's a lot of people in their mid 40s, early 40s, late 40s, perhaps 50s that are doing all the right things to build muscle, but they're either plateauing or peaking. Any thoughts?
Yes. So that is where understanding hormone replacement, and just other kinds of avenues to kind of approach. I think that there's a lot of, and this is where peptides come in, leveraging peptides, leveraging hormones, and then really making sure that the training stimulus is adequate. And then recovery, sleep, and nutrition.
So let's talk about that training stimulus. Can you extrapolate on that answer a little bit
Yeah.
more? Like, a lot of people think they train pretty hard or they train enough to build muscle, in their 40s or 30s or late 50s. But what's the truth?
The truth is most people are not working hard enough.
Mm.
Most people are not working hard enough. If you work hard enough, then you're never going to peak, right? There is potentially in your 80s, 70 or 80s, does it get more difficult? Yes. Should we focus on maintenance? Yes. Or muscle growth? Yes. But you can almost always build muscle. You can almost always get stronger. And most people are not working hard enough.
There's sort of a good wrap-up question here as we're running out of time.
Yeah.
Great talk. How do you take all of this and create a game plan for yourself?
Well, I have done that for you guys. I have literally done that for you. That's I put this all in my book, from beginning to end, how to do this if you are looking for longevity, if you are looking to build muscle, or you are looking to lose fat. Nutrition is so important and exercise is so important. Exercise will always trump nutrition, but again, majority of people are not hitting that stimulus, whereas everybody is eating.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Gabrielle Lyons. It's amazing. How can people find out more about you and work with you? Is it the book is a good place to get started, right?
Yes. Well, that's on pre-sale. You can watch my TED Talk and go to my website, which is Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. There's a whole bunch of links there. They can go to my Instagram, YouTube. My podcast bounces around between number 4 and number 6 in medicine. So for any physicians or who are interested, that's another great way to find me. And then we have a free newsletter and we do a lot of free resources, recipes and, paper analyses. So all kinds of things.
That's awesome. That's so amazing. Yeah. Thank you again.
Yeah.
Guys, thank you again for attending this webinar. And I really appreciate everyone's interest and all the great questions. And go ahead and, decide to take some action toward this. It's only half good if you just take this information in and do nothing with it. So, make a decision, do something with this information, start taking action and focus on your health, which is so powerful because that you don't want to be the richest man in the graveyard, So as we grow your wealth portfolio with all the Viking opportunities that are going to be coming down the line, by focusing on just health and vitality, I think it'll be amazing. So again, thank you again for attending this webinar. Thank you, Dr. Gabrielle Lyons, and there'll be a replay going out. So good night, everyone.
Bye.